Afghanistan, the wars never end. It has been one succession of war, one after the other, and it's just the players that have changed. It is probably very naive to think that this war really will end anytime soon.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm Christina Lopez-Guittardi. Today we welcome Mark Mazzetti, a correspondent for the New York Times who's covered national security for the newspaper's Washington bureau since April of 2006. In 2009, he shared a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the intensifying violence in Pakistan and Afghanistan and the response from the White House. The previous year, he was a Pulitzer finalist for reporting on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. He's also the recipient of the 2006 Gerald Ford Prize for distinguished reporting on national defense and the Livingston Award in the category of national reporting for breaking the story of the CIA's destruction of videotapes that showed harsh interrogation of al-Qaeda detainees. Before joining the New York Times, he was a staff writer for the LA Times, where he covered the Pentagon and military affairs, the Pentagon correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, and a correspondent for The Economist covering national politics. Since 9/11, he's made several reporting trips to Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Horn of Africa, including 2 months that he spent embedded with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and as a reporter in Baghdad in 2003. Mr. Mazzetti received his bachelor's degree in public policy and history from Duke University, where he graduated summa cum laude, and later earned a master's degree in modern history from Oxford University. Please join me in welcoming Mark Mazzetti.
Christina, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. A very kind introduction, especially for a Duke graduate. It is fabulous to be back at this great university at the Miller Center and to speak before this very impressive audience. Looking at the list beforehand of people who have spoken here at these forums, and who will speak in the future, including my colleague Jackie Combs on Friday, it's humbling to be up here tonight. So I appreciate the offer to speak. And because this issue is so central to everyone's lives these days, and because the stakes are so high, I promise not to drone on for too long tonight and to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. If at any point, as I'm speaking, you feel the need to interject and make a point, go ahead. But I want to sort of lay out some of the issues on this topic, and I understand that the announced topic title for the topic tonight was The War in Afghanistan, which is a very nice, simple subject you can easily deal with in 1 hour's time. But the good news is that it is so broad. I can bring a lot of things in, and short of talking about the Iraq War or Goldman Sachs, I think that we can cover a lot of ground this evening, and then get to the discussion. And when you talk about the war in Afghanistan, in many ways, it's somewhat of a misnomer to think that the war in Afghanistan began on September 12th, 2001. In Afghanistan, the wars never end. It has been one succession of war, one after the other. And it's just the players that have changed. In Afghanistan, you go there and you talk to people, and people mark time by the different wars that went on. People introduce their son and they say, well, so-and-so was born during the Soviet War. So-and-so's daughter was born during the Civil War of the 1990s. That is how major events are marked. That is how people differentiate important things like the births of their children. And it is probably very naive to think that this war really will end anytime soon because of the complicated dynamics. And that may mean that the U.S. may pull out. There may be a settled negotiation between the Karzai government and the Taliban, yet the conflict, the tensions are not likely to dissipate, I think, anytime soon. But I think what's going on now is different in a lot of ways than the wars of the past or the major conflicts of the past. Is different from what's called the Great Game period of the 19th century, when Britain and Russia were vying for control of Central Asia. And it's different than the 1980s during the Soviet invasion, when the United States and Pakistan, specifically in the CIA and the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, were funneling money and ammunition to the Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet Union. And the reason why I think it's different right now is that it's much more complicated. The stakes are much higher than even that period in the 1980s, for a couple of reasons. On one hand, you have, right now, India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers. They were not in the 1980s, although they were trying hard to become it. And so you have these two bitter rivalries, rivals that have nuclear weapons, who are using Afghanistan to some extent as a proxy for their fighting. It is unlikely, knock on wood, that they would escalate into a nuclear confrontation. But make no mistake, they are playing this out in other ways, and one of those places is in Afghanistan. So you have that as a backdrop, and I'm going to get into that a little bit as well. But also in this sort of technology age, the conduct of the war in Afghanistan is influencing millions of people, billions of people, in a region of the world that is not necessarily favorable to the United States, and whose opinion about the United States and U.S. policy are formed by, for instance, how the U.S. conducts itself in military confrontation. And so it's sort of this confluence of factors. And the technology is a huge part of it that make what is happening now in Afghanistan and in Pakistan that much more complicated and that much more significant, and where the potential for something going wrong really could have disastrous situations. So let's get at some of the dynamics, I think, that are going on now in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I'm going to actually talk just as much about Pakistan tonight as Afghanistan, because it is absolutely critical, and in many ways, well, in every way, actually, you can't talk about one without the other when you're looking at the conflict and you're looking at the U.S. interests in the region. I was just there in February for a few weeks in both Islamabad and Peshawar, Pakistan, and then went to Kabul afterwards to get different perspectives, and they are very different perspectives on what is going on. And I get the sense that the dynamics at this moment are changing very rapidly in ways that I've still not been able to figure it out. And it sounds somewhat trite to say the dynamics are changing, but what we're seeing now with the US military surge going into Afghanistan, the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military and intelligence services trying to figure out the effects of that surge and how it's going to impact Afghanistan, as well as the Karzai government's own calculations at this moment, I think make it incredibly complicated and incredibly dynamic. And there's no, it's safe to say that there's no story I've covered that is more complicated than this. Especially going to Pakistan, where I told some friends that it's the most complicated country I've ever been in. And each day I was there, it was safe to say I knew less and less. And as I wrote this in an email to one of my colleagues, and he said, "Get out of there before you know nothing." And it's true. By the time I left, any preconceived ideas I had were out the window, and I was thoroughly confused. And there is truth somewhere, but I never found anyone who's even been there for many years who's found it. So let's talk a little bit about Pakistan and then we'll move to across the border to Afghanistan. But some of the dynamics I think in Pakistan are especially interesting. And this is something I'll just sort of say definitively. The war in Afghanistan will be won or lost in Pakistan as much as it will be in Afghanistan. What happens in Pakistan and what the Pakistani government does or doesn't do to dismantle the sanctuary for Taliban leaders in the country will be one of the greatest determining factors into whether the current Obama administration strategy works. And when I talk about what the government does or doesn't do, I will give a very brief bit of background, and I know that this is a very educated audience and you don't need too much background into some of these dynamics, but just very quickly, one of the things that has been sort of the iron law of Pakistan for recent years, and really dating back to the 1980s, is that Pakistani's intelligence service, the ISI, will steadfastly support the Taliban. And that is because, well, there's many reasons. But the ISI and the military, which, make no mistake, is the most important institution inside Pakistan, sees the Taliban and other military groups as proxies, as a bulwark on the western border of Pakistan that allow the military to focus on what really matters, and that's India. So if you have proxy groups in the West, like the Taliban, and the Taliban are Pashtun, like the majority of Afghanistan is, and so there is some ethnic convergence there, then you don't have to devote divisions of Pakistan's army needlessly on the western border when you can go deal with Kashmir. So it's a very simplified explanation. That is one of the principal reasons why there has been this support. There's the Pashtun element and just the idea of having sort of a proxy force that means you can move your military off that border. And it's not just the traditional Taliban as we know it. There's a number of militant groups in the tribal areas of Pakistan that where there's been connections in the past. The ISI is a connection. One of them is the Haqqani, what's called the Haqqani Network, which if you read the papers, you read a lot about the Haqqani Network. And it's originally founded by Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was one of the fighters who the CIA supported in the 1980s and then took a turn toward a much more radical viewpoint and became closely aligned with the Taliban. But his network is known for and responsible for, it's believed responsible for a number of attacks inside of Afghanistan, including the base CIA bombing, the bombing of the CIA base in Khost in December of last year, as well as the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2008. So there's a group of militants that the ISI has traditionally supported. And they have, the ISI and the military, it is believed, have provided this safe haven inside Pakistan for the leaders of the Taliban who are seeking sanctuary in Pakistan but are actually directing the fighters over the border in Afghanistan. And over the years, especially since the September 11th attacks, the US has been on Pakistan's case repeatedly to help wrap up the leaders of the Taliban. They say, the US says, we know you know where they are. Stop supporting them. And they believe that the sort of biggest, the biggest factor of the outcome of the war in Afghanistan is whether Pakistan government moves against these leaders. Most of them in a region of Pakistan called Baluchistan, and more specifically around the city of Quetta in the south. So it was very interesting in January, late January, that the CIA and Pakistan's intelligence service got some information and picked up a top Taliban leader named Mullah Baradar in the southern Pakistani city of Karachi. Me and a colleague found out about this several weeks after the fact, and we thought this was quite a big deal. Why? Because who is Mullah Baradar? Mullah Baradar is the vice president of the Taliban. He is Mullah Omar's, or he was, Mullah Omar's right-hand man. I think he's the brother-in-law of Mullah Omar. And he is sort of seen as the military leader of the Taliban, directing sort of military strategy. Last year he put out rules of conduct for the Taliban in Afghanistan, sort of how to go about your business in Afghanistan so as not to anger the local population. It was very kind of interesting to read how the Taliban is interested in their own hearts and minds strategy in Afghanistan because both sides agree that it's the population that must be won over. Either side is going to win if they are able to win over the population. So Mullah Baradar was in charge of this sort of rules of behavior. So we reported the story that Mullah Baradar had been picked up by the Pakistanis. So this was really the biggest arrest of a top Taliban leader. It was a joint raid with the CIA and the ISI, but the fact that the ISI participated seemed like a very big deal, and it is a big deal, I think, meaning that maybe the dynamics had changed to some extent. Now, right after the story came out, I had all these ideas, and I got on a plane. I was actually already ready to go. It wasn't like I just jumped on a plane. And I got into Islamabad, and I was ready to test out my theories. And this is where everything that I thought went out the window. But basically, it came down to 3 theories about what is happening. Answering the question, why would the Pakistanis, after all this time, decide to wrap up one of the biggest, most important Taliban leaders? Have things changed? And if they do that, are they going to do more? And are they really, really serious about cracking down on the Taliban, which could have a really big impact in the war in Afghanistan? So, 3 theories. I'll go through them quickly. First of them is that Pakistan has totally changed its tune. The Pakistani government has now firmly believed that it can't distinguish one militant group from another. They are all potentially dangerous, and that they have finally sort of caved to U.S. pressure to move against some of these leaders. That's theory number 1. Conspiracy theory, that's number 2. And that's the Pakistanis are playing a game. And this has been in some of the reporting, actually, why did they go after Mullah Baradar? Because he was involved in negotiations with the Karzai government. The Taliban was going to negotiate with Karzai, and the Pakistanis were dead set on that not happening. And the only way they could tank those negotiations, which could lead to a negotiated settlement, was by picking up the main interlocutor of the Taliban. And the CIA were their dupes in this effort. So they picked this guy up. The CIA goes along. They think it's a great thing because they picked up this Taliban leader, when in fact the guy's negotiating with Karzai on the other side of the border, and all is well because these negotiations don't go anywhere. That's another theory, and it is actually believed by many. And it has been actually out in published reports that this is all that's going on. Finally, there's the third theory, which is actually what I believe, and it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. Because there's not one easy, clean explanation when you're talking about these situations. Pakistan wants to accelerate the end game in Afghanistan. An endless war in Afghanistan does not do anyone any good, especially the Pakistani military and intelligence establishment, the civilian government, and they are going to do enough to weaken the Taliban to get them to the negotiating table in Afghanistan. But they won't do this without extracting what they want and influencing the dynamic of the endgame. Pakistan is not going to simply turn over the negotiations to the Karzai government and let Karzai have his way in the future of Afghanistan without having their own seat at the table. Pakistan is determined to have a significant amount of influence in Afghanistan after the shooting stops, when hopefully the shooting does stop. And so they are going to determine, they're going to try to determine how these final negotiated settlement works. So if they can exert influence over the Taliban, even by picking up some of its leaders, they can then have, to some extent, influence over a large swath of Afghan territory in any kind of future negotiated settlement. And that territory is southern Afghanistan, which is the Pashtun part of Afghanistan. And that's really what Pakistan is interested in. They don't want to take over Afghanistan, but they do want to have a significant amount of influence because it's in their own national interest. The other thing they want to do is they want to beat back Indian influence inside of Afghanistan. One of the more interesting moments of my time in Pakistan was sitting at a wedding, a Pakistani wedding in Islamabad, speaking to an ISI agent at the wedding with his young son bouncing on his knee, going on and on about how the Indians were making mischief in southern Baluchistan, and the United States was helping them. And the only way for the Pakistanis to sort of get back at India was to use militant groups to launch attacks inside of Afghanistan. So he firmly believed that the US and India were conspiring against Pakistan, so why shouldn't they do it on their own? So this is the sort of level of conspiracy that goes on that's believed by very serious people, very smart people, and people who are actually in power. Okay. I'm getting to Afghanistan and the dynamics over there in 1 second, but I think one thing that must be said is that since Mullah Baradar's arrest in the end of February, there has not been a wave of arrests. It does not seem as if Pakistan is determined to take down the entire the entire leadership council in Pakistan. So it is still unclear a bit how they are going to sort of weaken the Taliban. Are they going to do this as sort of over time, trying to influence Mullah Baradar during his interrogations and then get him to turn some of his people? It's still unclear what's going to happen. But I do believe that this dynamic is changing a bit, because I think from talking to enough people on the Pakistan side of the border, they do believe that the war needs to end, but they want it to end on their own terms. Afghanistan, after I left Islamabad after a few weeks, I went over to primarily talk to the US military, which was a very interesting time to be in Afghanistan, because it was right after the Marja offensive. And Marja was the small town in southern Afghanistan that the US military took over, in essence, after the invasion, and it's what the military hopes is the beginning of a wider offensive in southern Afghanistan, which will probably culminate, as has been reported widely, in an offensive in Kandahar in Afghanistan, the biggest city in southern Afghanistan, later this summer. And there was a lot of optimism, actually, when I was there, among the American military, that this Marja offensive really was sort of changing momentum. That after a year of sliding backwards, Marja was the first step towards reversing the momentum, and with the new troops coming in, it would be the first component of the counterinsurgency strategy that would allow the US military, the Afghan military, and the Karzai government to sort of retake southern Afghanistan after years when the Taliban had exerted more control. What is the reality? The hope was that this really was changing. The reality may be something different, although, again, it's too early to make any kind of judgments. But just reading my own colleagues' reporting from Marja since that operation, there is some reason to be concerned. I'll pointing specifically, and you can go back and read this article, a colleague of mine, Rich Oppel, earlier this month went down to Marja. So this was about 2 months after the operation. And he wrote a story that said, that was the headline, "Violence helps Taliban undo Afghan gains." And his major point was that, yes, they had this offensive, yes, it had had initial successes, but by talking to US military officers, it seems that some of those gains were ephemeral. One Marine major was quoted in the article as saying the Taliban had, quote, "re-seized control and momentum in a lot of ways." And that so many people identify themselves as Taliban, it's difficult to really, for the American military to understand who the enemy is. General Larry Nicholson, commander of a Marine brigade in that town, said this: "We've got to reevaluate our definition of enemy. Most people identify themselves as Taliban, so we have to readjust our thinking. So we're not trying to chase the Taliban out of Marja, we're trying to chase the enemy out." Now, if you think about that quote, it's confusing. And imagine how confusing it is to a young Marine Lance Corporal who is trying to carry out a mission. You're not trying to chase the Taliban out, you're trying to chase the enemy out. So this is, I mean, it sounded like a very telling quote, and it's just some of the very complicated dynamics about not only Marja, but in a bigger operation for Kandahar. How will they be able to determine the success of a future, potentially much more bloody operation in Kandahar, especially with these long-standing ties in the south between the Taliban that hooks into the poppy production, the opium production, and the broader Pashtun nationalities. And we can get into some of specifically the poppy issue, maybe in a Q&A. But I wanted to, while I had a little more time, talk about how all these dynamics fit together, and also another component of what I'm covering right now on this, and that is the sort of CIA efforts going on in the region. So we see that there's some dynamics changing in Pakistan right now, I believe. Afghanistan, there is a very complicated picture, and one that remains murky. Even as American military forces, more of them move in, and as they prepare for a Kandahar offensive, it is very unclear to me, and I am by far, I'm far from an expert on the country, and my colleagues who have spent more time there are, and I talked to them about it. They say that they don't quite see how this ends this year, in the sense of how will this strategy really play out. They're not saying it won't work, but it's very hard to sort of give any definitive answers about how the McChrystal strategy really will play out across the South. One of the things I wanted to get to, as I said, about the CIA is what they're doing, which has become very public, and it's their piece of this war, most of it taking place in Pakistan, and that's this drone campaign. It's a covert action, which in the CIA means the president signs a secret order and they carry it out, and the U.S. denies what they do. But the drone campaign is like the most overt covert action in history, because we write about it, people talk about it, there's a lot of winks and nods, and that's for, I think, some pretty interesting reasons. One is because the CIA believes it's having great success. The Bush administration, at the tail end of its time in office, really accelerated the drone campaign. They'd reached a point where they felt the Pakistanis were not going to really move against militants in the tribal areas, and they needed to do it on their own. It had become a clear and present danger, so they sort of accelerated this drone campaign. What has been interesting in covering the Obama White House in its first year, the Obama White House has accelerated it from the Bush administration. There's been, I believe, there were twice as many drone attacks in the first year of the Obama administration as there were in the last year of the Bush administration. The White House has embraced this for a lot of reasons. One, I think because they feel like it is having success. And there are also Obama administration officials who are very eager to get that message out. The message of they're having success in the tribal areas against al-Qaeda, and they won't say, by the way, the CIA hit so-and-so, but they basically do, in a way to sort of get their message out, because I think there is a political concern in the White House and among the Obama administration that the attacks from the Republicans and the right and people like former Vice President Cheney might have some political effect. So I think they want to try to counter that message. Not to say that the drone campaign in itself is political, but I think the way this is being played out and the messaging of it, to some extent, has become politicized. And I'm very eager to chat with you during the Q&A about what you think of the drone campaign, and if you have more questions about exactly how these are carried out and what the strategy is for, and the reasoning for accelerating. But I want to actually close on one final point, which I just found interesting and somewhat telling, and as a reporter I found somewhat heartening. Because as I said, as reporters, we're always trying to kind of grope around in the dark to understand what's going on. So I was somewhat heartened earlier this year by a fascinating report that was made public by the top military intelligence officer in Afghanistan, a guy named Major General Michael Flynn. Flynn is the top intel officer for Stanley McChrystal, very smart individual, seasoned individual, was formerly in Iraq. And he said that basically he called the intelligence community on the carpet and he said, you guys are irrelevant. You guys are not giving me what I need to carry out a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. You are not giving me what I need, which is a deeper understanding about how the country works. Don't just tell me where the bad guys are. Tell me which local leader is important in this area. Tell me, which water source is of particular is creating rivalries in different reasons. You don't tell me that, and so how do I carry out a counterinsurgency? And this is to quote his report. He said, quote, 8 years into the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. intelligence community is only marginally relevant to the overall strategy. having focused the overwhelming majority of its collection efforts and analytical brain power on insurgent groups, the vast intelligence apparatus is unable to answer fundamental questions about the environment in which the U.S. and allied forces operate and the people they seek to persuade. That's pretty tough coming from the top intelligence officer. And he goes on to talk about a new model for intelligence officers in Afghanistan to understand a Byzantine place like Afghanistan. And what is that model that he cites? According to the general, a man who has billions of dollars of American intelligence technology at his disposal, the people who he oversees need to become more like reporters. He said, he talks actually about the role of the media in Afghanistan to decipher the tribal structure and the power politics. And he said, this is what we need to know. So in other words, if the U.S. is going to have a shot in Afghanistan, and if the intelligence community is going to be relevant to the overall strategy, and to really understand the country, intelligence officers better start acting more like reporters. So maybe in the end, we aren't so much in the dark after all. Thank you very much, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. In a few moments, I'll actually head to the back of the room and begin taking questions from the audience. So I invite everyone to please line up in the back with me. But I'd like to start the conversation exactly where you left off. And you touched upon the 8 CIA operatives who were killed in Afghanistan in December. But if you can kind of think more broadly what this means in terms of, you've touched upon what it means in terms of intelligence efforts within the region, but what does it mean in terms of, what does it signify for the agency specifically and the direction that it's going in? You've also written that the CIA has been forced to sort of transform itself into sort of a quasi-paramilitary organization. Can you comment on this more broadly?
Yes, and that's been one of the really interesting trends, I think, of the last several years. And it really hit home on December 30th when we learned about the base that had been hit. Not because we didn't know there were bases out there in eastern Afghanistan, but to learn more about the sort of network of bases that the CIA has set up in Afghanistan, and I think to some extent over the border as well. But it is the agency's primary efforts these days are going after al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network, gathering intelligence by signals intelligence, human intelligence, that will lead to drone strikes. That is what the White House wants the CIA to do, and not to the exclusion of everything else, but it's really their main focus. And when you talk to CIA officials, that's what they're talking about. Now, when you look at this as a transformation, now the CIA has always had paramilitary function. They've had paramilitary groups that have gone into countries around the world to carry out covert actions. But I think that since September 11th, it really is striking that the CIA is going around the world hunting and killing militants. And that is, they were given that task shortly after the September 11th attacks. And so it moves it away from an intelligence gathering organization, which is collecting information about inside countries that is then used to inform policymakers, and much more of a sort of military-like organization that is going, that is kind of crossing names off a list of top militants. Now, that's neither a good nor bad thing. It's something that it is a fact, and I think that the CIA has found itself in this position where they, in many ways, get a seat at the table at the White House because they are carrying out this mission. And as I said, both President Bush and President Obama have leaned on them to carry out this mission. And I think, to some extent, many in the CIA see this as a way to, keep the CIA very relevant when they've been sort of barraged from all these different fronts since September 11th over the WMD and then the creation of the Directorate of National Intelligence. Many believe they were sort of shunted to the side. Well, in the first year of the Obama administration, they're front and center.
Mr. Mazzetti, enjoy reading your stuff in the Times. I've got two questions. One's rather frivolous, but the other follows up on the point that you just made. I'll try the frivolous one first. Do you have an idea of where Osama bin Laden may be? Do you have a notion of whether we're going to be successful in locating him?
Well, I guess it's somewhat telling that that's considered frivolous, or that when you ask, people laugh or chuckle. I mean, it's something that, and I, sometimes if I ask the question of a leader, I feel frivolous asking it, because it's almost like how far we've come, when this was the single most important thing to do was to find Osama bin Laden dead or alive, and now it's almost an afterthought, only in the sense that it's an afterthought because you know to stop asking people, because you know they don't know where he is. The latest I heard was that the intelligence community thinks he is in part of the tribal areas of Pakistan north of North Waziristan. So one of the provinces above North and South Waziristan, but they don't really have any clear clue, and they've not had any real, I think, hard evidence about his whereabouts for several years. I certainly am the last to know where he is, but I think a lot of people in the CIA are as well. I don't mean to sound too frivolous, but they're trying. But it is amazing. If you had asked me after September 11th that I'd be here, almost 9 years later, and we would not have caught him, I would have said that that's impossible. But they do think he is alive, and as well as his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. That was your first question.
Thanks. Yeah. And on a more manageable plane, if you will, the issue of the Predator and this success that we seem to be enjoying in taking out al-Qaeda leaders. Do you have any, I'm on the team. I really believe that this is an important thing to do, but I worry a little bit about it being a covert action, that it being a military activity that a civilian organization is involved in, and a little bit that it may be, although it's much more successful than earlier efforts, it looks a little bit as if we're using our technology to fight the battles, which we should do, but that in terms of how it's going to be regarded over time in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we may draw criticism because of the collateral damage done and the fact that we're using our toys to do something terribly important.
Yeah, you're using robots to do a man's job. That is, you hear that actually. And I think that your question is a good one, and I wrote a sort of story in our Week in Review about it a year ago, sort of raising this issue of what does it mean to sort of fall in love with this sort of seductive tool of drone warfare, and I don't think anyone, or not anyone, but I think that those sort of deeper questions aren't getting asked right now, because it's, at least by policymakers, because they're very focused on the successes, what these drones can do. But it does raise all sorts of questions about the future. Why would we use anything but drones if we could in the future? I mean, Pakistan the reason we're doing it in Pakistan is because Pakistan's government will not allow U.S. Troops there, and they can deny it, and deny that it's going on, and even sort of say we're angry about it, but in fact they're blessing all of this privately. They're giving intelligence for drone attacks. So really the public angst over it is really for just public consumption in Pakistan. But it's the long-term implications I don't think have quite been dealt with, but I do think that I can see it. My sense is that they could extend a drone campaign to Yemen and beyond. And then what's to stop other countries? Once they cross technological boundaries and get the drones, them from using drones as well. Pakistan sending drones over the border into India. I mean, there's a lot of interesting questions. I will say that it is the impact does seem real in terms of sowing fear. I was talking to a former CIA officer who was just over there, and he said actually in the tribal areas, people have stopped drinking Lipton tea. Lipton tea bags, because they're convinced that the tea bags have beacons in them that will lead to the drone attacks. So they've just sworn off Lipton tea, and it's sort of not good for the Lipton Tea Company in Pakistan because they drink a lot of tea. But no, someone, and spread a rumor, and they're convinced that, I guess, the last 4 or 5 people who had been drinking Lipton tea got killed, so they can do without it. So it's a sort of humorous story, but it sort of shows that the sort of psychological impact of this stuff.
Mr. Zanev, thank you very much for your expose. You are certainly an expert, but you left me very worried because from your presentation, there's no solution for the coming years. So I will ask you a question. Are we not facing a repetition of the Vietnam drama? We are in Afghanistan fighting a war for 8 years. Thousands of men, billions, and many dead. We are fighting for a government which is one of the most corrupt governments in the world. For Mr. Karzai, who, like Mr. Thieu, stole the election. You mentioned very, very vaguely, en passant, the poppy, the heroin, one of the biggest business. And maybe you should look into the fourth alternative, the cahoots between the Pakistani and the Afghanistans to smuggle the heroin out. That's the fourth. So the question I ask is, what is the strategy? If you are at war, you either do it or you don't do it, but you don't go half and half. So how does a country like the United States is going to win this war and come out with honor? Otherwise, what will happen in Afghanistan is the same thing that happened to the British. You probably know that the British garrison in Kabul fell to the Afghanistan. They killed every single soldier but the doctor. And they sent him across the border to tell to the British on the other side of Khyber Pass, don't come back. The Soviets, nice people, people who really respected human rights. They have the New York Times, they have the LA, they have the CBC, the NBS. I mean, a bunch of real tough guys. They came out with their tail between their legs. Okay, America helped Italy. You had a very good senator. So how do we come out of this thing? Winning a war or retreating? What is your strategy?
My strategy? Good questions, provocative questions. Listen, there's a lot of complicated questions, and no one that I've spoken to will pretend to have the definite answers of how they think it's going to happen. I watched people last year, end of last year, wrestle with this idea of whether to send more troops or not. And frankly, talking to people, I could have argued it both ways, and I saw real benefit of both, and I saw people passionately switching sides about whether to leave or whether to send more troops, and I'm not going to weigh in on what I think right here about whether it's Vietnam or not. I think that though there are some concerns. And I didn't mean to leave the impression from my talk tonight that it was hopeless, because I think that there are some positive dynamics and there's some negative dynamics, and we have to see how this shakes out. But I will say that there is a belief that they are taking this war seriously, that they are resourcing this war appropriately, that the person and the people in charge on the military side are the right people. They've got the smartest people in the military doing it after years of under-resourcing the war. I mean, and that's a military term for saying, you didn't have enough there, right? The 2 commanders ago, General McNeil gave his last public speech in Afghanistan was basically taking Washington to task for not caring about Afghanistan. There was a shift in focus to Iraq. He basically said, we don't have enough here, and you can't expect us to win a war if you don't give us what we need. And so they're doing that, and some would argue, well, it's too late. But there is a strategy in place and being carried out that they hope by the end of the year will have not defeated the Taliban, but beaten back Taliban and influence enough to establish local control and get Afghan security forces and police forces in these local territories to get people, the locals, convinced that they're here to stay. Now, you've got the Karzai problem, which you raised, right? And frankly, there is a lot of concern in Washington that Karzai is hopeless. I guess I'd put it that way. That there is a camp that believes the U.S. should no longer be supporting him. There is another view in the government that this guy was elected, and he is all that there is. And so you're seeing an interesting, and two of my colleagues wrote about it, I think, last week, where the Obama administration is taking a different approach to Karzai now. You started out where President Obama wanted to be sort of very different than President Bush. President Bush used to have weekly video conferences with Karzai, as well as President Maliki of Iraq. It was very personal diplomacy. And Obama sort of wanted to do the opposite and say, you know, you don't deal with me directly, you deal with my people, you deal with the ambassador in Kabul, and sort of take a hands-off approach. And I think that in the Obama administration, they're realizing that was not the right approach. And some of his advisors have actually told the president, you may not like it, but you've got to be present, and you've got to be in their face, specifically Karzai's face, and if you want to get him to change and get what you want from him, you've got to repeatedly ask. And I think that's a bit of a shift right now that we're seeing, and we'll see whether that works. Now, I didn't mean to give short shrift to the poppy issue, which is a major issue. And I was looking at the time, and I was thinking, how am I going to deal with all this stuff? So I'm glad you raised it. I was there in 2004. And I spent a couple weeks with the Special Forces, a Green Beret team out in eastern Afghanistan. And it was amazing. I mean, the base that we were situated at was surrounded by miles and miles of poppy fields. And you had this Green Beret team who would walk through the poppy fields every day on the way to their missions. And you know, you'd talk to them, and they would say, frankly, you know, our job here is not to get people to get rid of opium. We've got other things to do. We're a small team. These are people, this is their livelihood. It's going to take something a lot bigger than us. And you know, they would go to local farmers and hand out flyers and say, okay, well, next year you're going to plant wheat, right? And they said, yes, we're going to plant wheat. It didn't happen, of course, not when there's such an economic incentive to plant poppies. And so, you know, there's I can say a very serious concern in the intelligence community that Afghanistan could become a narco state, and that it is fueling the corruption that seems to be rampant in the Karzai government. So I probably only partially answered your questions, but I couldn't go further. I'd get fired.
Congratulations on your reporting. I'd like to carry the question that Fred asked a little further. What would you judge as the residual level of our interest in Afghanistan if the al-Qaeda leadership is either killed, captured, or turns up in a third country? And secondly, could you just say a word about the relations between the fundamentalist Shia regime in Iran and the fundamentalist Sunni Taliban?
Okay, good questions. This was a big part of the debate in last fall inside the Obama administration before they announced their new strategy was, do we care about the Taliban, really? Or do we just care that the Taliban is aligned with al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda is what we really worry about because they have the ability to attack the United States and they attack Western Europe, and if there was no al-Qaeda, would we really care? And it's a very legitimate question. Because we're a long way from the early days after 9/11 when we were hoping, and there were public statements about transforming Afghanistan into a democracy and making it a place, a bastion of civil liberties. I don't think that that's what the expectation is anymore. But I think that there is at least a baseline understanding that even if al-Qaeda the top leadership was killed, they fled to Yemen or they fled to Somalia, that there would still be an interest in at least making sure the Karzai government or the Afghan government is competent enough, as well as their security forces, probably mostly their security forces, to beat back a kind of threat in the future. So it's not just a question of, get al-Qaeda and go home. I think part of the strategy that McChrystal has laid out is really ensuring that you can leave Afghanistan with a credible security force. And that will prevent the sort of pre-9/11 Afghanistan. In Pakistan, though, you go back to this question of what if Pakistan is allowed just to have, the sanctuary is going to continue. Afghan troops can't go over the border into Pakistan. And basically, Pakistan's government, it goes hot and cold about whether they want to launch military operations into their own tribal areas. So even if the United States were to leave Afghanistan with a credible security forces, there is the big question of whether that threat could materialize on the Pakistani side of the border, kind of like it had up to a point in 2008. So I think that there is a lingering, there are lingering interests, although I think that the Obama administration will take less than the Bush administration would have taken in its early days to sort of declare victory, I guess, to put it that way. Your question about Iran and the Taliban, it's an interesting one. Yes, there's a ideological difference. There's religious differences. One is Sunni and one is Shia. And it's always a little bit murky. It's been murky about how much support Iran gives to the Taliban. The military intelligence officials I talked to say that there has been support. There have been weapons shipments over the western border into Afghanistan to help the Taliban. It's a sort of alliance of interests. Iran is trying to weaken the United States where it can in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they'll even work with the Taliban, who are historically their enemies, to do it. But I don't get the sense that this is foremost on the minds of American commanders, that what Iran is doing over there in Western Afghanistan is really a game changer in terms of in making the Taliban a lot stronger.
Pakistan has recently changed the name of the Northwest Frontier Provinces to something akin to Pashtun, and I wonder if you see that as a significant step on their part to any endpoint that they might see in one of your theories.
Yeah, I was there actually when this was happening, and the governor of the Northwest Frontier Province I was talking to, and he was saying, well, the change is because, there's this sort of air of British imperialism to the term Northwest Frontier Province, which is what it was. It was the frontier of the British Empire, that beyond which was like the crazy tribal lands, and Peshawar, the city in western Pakistan, was the edge. And there's a fort. It's really a fascinating place. There's a fort on a mountain in Peshawar where the British garrison was and the Pakistani garrison is now. And it's the sort of edge of what was the British Empire and is now really the edge of the Pakistani government control. So why the name change? I don't know whether it has anything to do with a bid to sort of have Pashtun nationalism or to sort of ingratiate themselves with the Pashtuns on the other side of the border. But I do think that if it's not overtly that, there is a belief in the Pakistani government that you have to appeal to the Pashtuns, wherever they may be, and where they are is southern Pakistan, southwest Pakistan, southeastern Afghanistan, and that this Pashtun belt that some call Pashtunistan is the way for Pakistan to influence what's going on the other side of the border, and they will continue to do that. And I think when I talked about the end game, I think that the settlement they would probably accept is, even if it's not called Taliban influence over the South, it is Pashtun influence over large parts of southern Afghanistan, which really would mean Pakistani influence as well. And I think that's how they see it, because the rest is, and President Karzai's government is made up of a lot of non-Pashtuns who are Hazars and Tajiks who are from the north, and they don't like each other at all. And the Pakistanis believe that the Indians are influencing the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the rest of Karzai's government. And the Indians, you know, there are ties there historically. So again, it's another place where the sort of new great game of Pakistan and India is being played out in Afghanistan.
Sir, I admire not only your reportage, but your courage. It strikes me as a very dangerous place for, well, reporters anyhow. My question is about the American policy for military personnel in places like Afghanistan and certainly in Iraq. My impression was the rule is 1 year and then you go home. And it struck me that if you really need to get into the minds and hearts of the local people, learn what the people are about, make friendships with the local sheikhs and negotiate, that this is downright silly. Number one, am I right in characterizing it as silly? And number two, are they changing it any? Thank you.
On whether it's silly or not, this is one of those things, if I answer it, I get fired. I mean, there's a lot of concern. You're right, and basically, they do one-year tours. They extended the tours in Iraq and Afghanistan to 15 months. I believe that was the longest period of time. This was Secretary Gates did it again because they had to. They didn't have enough people. So the longest was 15 months. And they felt like that was the longest they could do it without breaking the Army and the Marine Corps and basically having a mass exodus from the volunteer military. But there is a lot of concern and a lot of complaints from people in the region rotating out. They say, you know, I'm just finally understanding how this place works, and now I leave. And so they then have to have this elaborate changeover, which they do. The military does it well. I mean, they bring someone in. The new guy comes for 6 weeks, and the guy rotating out introduces him to all of the sort of local leaders and important people, and gives him a feel for the job. But it is only like a 6-week transition, or maybe even less. And there's a lot of knowledge that goes out, that gets on the plane and goes back to the United States, leaving the new group to start from scratch to some extent. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it strikes me that the only alternative really is go to a draft. I mean, if you want to have a volunteer military and maintain it, and make sure that people, you know, maintain family lives and all that, and re-enlist. You're going to have to do that, or you're going to have an exodus, and you're not going to have send anyone to fight. So my guess is that there's no movement that I hear towards a draft. So I think that's going to be the way it's going to be for a while.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate your insights. I give you the rhetorical question. Does U.S. presence in Afghanistan support Kayani in convincing himself that the Taliban in Pakistan is more critical to the stability of Pakistan than is the threat from India in Kashmir? Does the U.S. presence in Afghanistan convince Kayani? He's an interesting guy because he's a graduate of the United States Army Command and General Staff College. He's been around. And quite frankly, right now we have 2 Pakistani officers. One of them just won the Essay Award at Leavenworth this year. But we have had Pakistani officers in the United States military education system for a long time until we tilted towards India. But this is a rhetorical question.
Well, I think that there's a lot of attention and effort that gets put towards figuring out what Kayani thinks. And for those who don't know, General Kayani is the senior military officer in Pakistan. he's in charge of the armed forces. He's in charge. He really runs the ISI, although there is a general in charge of the ISI. He's a former head of the ISI, and so it makes him basically the most powerful person in Pakistan. And to your question, he has said publicly that we can no longer distinguish between Pakistan Taliban and Afghanistan Taliban. So in other words, the Afghanistan Taliban, to be clear, are the ones fighting in Afghanistan whose leadership, as I said, is based in Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban, however, are kind of a whole other group. They're the ones who have been responsible for attacks inside of Pakistan, believed to have killed Benazir Bhutto, responsible for a number of really significant suicide bombings in Islamabad and Peshawar, including the Marriott bombing in Islamabad. And so these are the ones they're really worried about, and these are the ones they're going into the mountains to fight. So can you distinguish between the two? And does the U.S. presence convince him of anything? I think that he is concerned that the old Pakistan policy of using one group and fighting another, especially when they're all in the same area and sort of drawing from the same pool, is probably fruitless. He probably sees a losing strategy of trying to have the Afghan Taliban as their proxy force while the Pakistan Taliban are the ones they're trying to kill. He's a smart guy, and it does seem that he does believe that. But at the same time, this probably doesn't mean that they're going to cut all ties to the Afghan Taliban. Again, because the Afghan Taliban are going to be very essential for their future influence. I don't know if I've quite answered your question, but I think that the Kayani mindset is basically, in many ways, the most important thing for the U.S. to figure out, and he's the most important person for the U.S. to influence, because he will shape the strategy for whether, in fact, Pakistan does take more guys like Mullah Baradar and arrest them, or whether he sets Mullah Baradar free and to go back and do what he was doing before.
Thank you very much, Mark, for helping us navigate this difficult subject.
Okay, thank you.